In the war in Ukraine, the battle for Donetsk has been a months-long grinding war of attrition. Every confrontation in the battle costs dozens of lives on both sides, but neither side gained an advantage. But something has shifted. Ukrainian forces are done merely holding the line or slowly ceding parts of it to Russian forces. Instead, they're punching through it and taking their country back one village and town at a time. Here's how Ukraine is storming over Russian defenses and turning the momentum to its favor. Recent reports confirm that Ukraine has liberated multiple villages in the strategically critical Pokrovsk-Dobropilya corridor, inflicting catastrophic losses on Russian forces in the process. But this isn't just about reclaiming a few villages here and there. Ukraine's current strategy is all about gaining the upper hand at a crucial moment when the entire trajectory of the war, and potentially the terms of any peace deal, hang in the balance. For instance, during operations to liberate the village of Suketska, Ukraine's 82nd Separate Air Assault Brigade engaged a relatively small Russian force that was patrolling the area. The result was 44 Russian soldiers killed, 8 wounded, and 9 surrendered. The Ukrainian command described the operation as lightning fast and uncompromising, a stark contrast to Russia's months-long grind that has yielded territorial gains measured in football fields. Suketska isn't an isolated victory. In October, Ukrainian forces cleared another village roughly 20 miles north of the vital city of Pokrovsk. All told, after Russia's sudden 7-mile push in early August, Ukraine has now reclaimed 9 villages in the area, with another 9 cleared of Russian sabotage groups. Each village reclaimed represents a critical piece of Ukraine's defensive architecture, extending its effective range and denying Russia key staging areas for future assaults. But the scale of Ukraine's pushback becomes truly apparent when you look at the broader operational picture. As of October 26th, Ukrainian forces have liberated 72 square miles of its territory and cleared an additional 94 square miles of the Pokrovsk sector from Russian presence. To put that in perspective, we're talking about liberating an area roughly the size of Washington, D.C. in 10 days. And through all of that, the human toll on Russian forces has been devastating. In those same 10 days, the Ukrainian military reports it has eliminated 1,756 enemy troops, including kills, injuries, and captures, and destroyed 75 pieces of military equipment. And if we zoom out to view the full 2-month period since Ukraine began stabilizing the sector on August 21st, we see the numbers become truly staggering. Over 15,700 Russian personnel casualties and 1,364 pieces of weaponry and equipment destroyed are being reported. That's more than some countries have in their entire standing armies. Concerning equipment, Ukrainian forces have reportedly destroyed 36 Russian tanks, 121 armored fighting vehicles, 162 artillery systems, 5 multiple-launch rocket systems, 447 vehicles, 592 motorcycles and quad bikes, and also 1 special-purpose vehicle. The last point here is notable, as the motorcycles and quad bikes are part of Russia's desperate attempt to use cheap civilian vehicles for infantry mobility due to armored transport becoming too costly or ineffective. In addition, in a war increasingly dominated by unmanned systems, Ukrainian forces have knocked out 4,689 Russian drones in this sector alone. Some of these equipment losses are things that Russia can't recover from easily. Take the tanks as an example. While reports differ enormously, some analysts suggest that Russia's tank production capacity is somewhere around 300 to 400 tanks a year. Those numbers include production of new and renewal of older tanks. So when you destroy 36 tanks in 2 months in a single sector, and Russia is producing and renewing roughly 34 a month, those losses become strategically significant. The situation in Pokrovsk itself remains contested but increasingly stable, as October 25th saw nearly 30% of the 181 engagements across the front line happen around the city. While Russian forces have managed to install approximately 200 troops into the city, they're effectively trapped in an urban killing ground. Small arms fighting and intense drone operations are ongoing, but Ukrainian counter-sabotage actions are systematically thwarting Russian attempts to advance deeper or establish fortified positions. Every time Russian forces try to consolidate or push forward, Ukrainian drone units and infantry locate and eliminate them. Recent days have also seen Russian forces desperately increasing their use of armored vehicles in assault operations, a marked shift from the infantry-heavy tactics that have proven so costly, but the changes yielding similarly dismal results. Between October 20th and 25th, Russian forces conducted 41 armored vehicle-supported assaults across the entire front line. In the Pokrovsk sector specifically, on October 25th alone, Ukrainian forces destroyed 1 armored fighting vehicle and 2 motorcycles in the Pokrovsk area. plus another armored fighting vehicle in the nearby Balahan sector. By some counts, almost every single vehicle Russia committed to those assaults was destroyed. To fully understand why these recent Ukrainian gains are so significant, let's zoom out again and look at the strategic landscape. Pokrovsk and Dobropilya are practically the linchpins of the entire Donetsk defense network, and their fate could determine who controls the region for decades to come. Moscow has made clear its intention to fully occupy the Donetsk region as part of what it calls its primary war aims. This goes beyond simply controlling the territory and more to its reasons for doing so, the ability to extract resources and people from them to further Russia's longer-term goals. At this point, full control of Donetsk would allow Russia to claim it's achieved its stated objective of liberating the Donbass and its Russian-speaking majority, even though most people there claim to be Ukrainian by culture and nationality. It would provide Putin with a narrative victory he desperately needs both domestically and internationally, further fueling his domestic propaganda. But there's a more practical military dimension too. Donetsk's industrial infrastructure, despite being heavily damaged, still represents significant economic value. More importantly, full occupation would give Russia defensible borders aligned with the administrative boundaries it has claimed through illegal annexation. For Moscow, Donetsk is the key to consolidating gains and creating a frozen conflict on its terms. And Pokrovsk sits at the heart of this ambition. Western analysts consider Pokrovsk a gateway to the most heavily fortified areas left in Ukraine's hands in the Donetsk region. Stationed at the intersection of multiple supply highways, Pokrovsk also houses a regionally significant railway hub that can feed into the entire Donbass from Ukraine's side. But even worse, this also means that supply lines can go the other way, and if Russian forces take over Pokrovsk, they could more easily clear out the rest of Donetsk. This could lead to further advances toward Dnipro and Zaporizhia, potentially opening the door to removing Ukraine's hold on the broader southeast. This is why Russia has thrown everything at Pokrovsk. Despite the front line extending for over 600 miles across Ukraine, some sources indicate around half of recent assaults have occurred in the Pokrovsk-Kurakova directions. An earlier analysis of the military maps provided by Deep State in August suggested that Russia intended to besiege Pokrovsk by encircling it from three sides, north, south, and east. The ongoing sabotage and infiltration attempts are just another way for Russia to attempt to gain a foothold in the city, while the recent village liberations directly go counter to that tactic. Now let's flip the script and look at why Pokrovsk and Dobropilya are absolutely vital for Ukrainian defenses. It could be said that these cities are force multipliers that extend Ukraine's operational reach across the entire region. Dobropilya, located about 13 miles north of Pokrovsk, is a critical northern anchor in Ukraine's defense network. Continued control of Dobropilya allows Ukrainian forces to maintain artillery and drone coverage over key highways and railway lines that Russia needs to sustain any advance toward Pokrovsk. Without Dobropilya, Ukraine's ability to threaten Russian logistics and reinforcements collapses, turning Pokrovsk into an isolated fortress that can be slowly strangled. But it's about more than just geography. Pokrovsk and Dobropilya together form what is essentially a mutually supporting defensive zone. Artillery positioned in Dobropilya can cover approaches to Pokrovsk, while forces in Pokrovsk can provide fire support for Dobropilya. This creates overlapping fields of fire that make any Russian advance exponentially more costly. And the railway station in Pokrovsk is particularly crucial. It can be used to quickly move troops, ammunition, fuel, heavy equipment, and medical supplies to much of the Donbass sector. Lose Pokrovsk railway hub, and Ukraine's ability to sustain defensive operations across Donetsk degrades dramatically. Supply runs that used to take hours by rail suddenly require days by truck over roads constantly targeted by Russian artillery and drones. So as long as Ukraine holds both Pokrovsk and Dobropilya, it maintains the capability to project force across Donetsk. Meanwhile, drone operations can reach deeper into Russian-held territory. Artillery can interdict Russian supply lines. Electronic warfare systems can disrupt Russian communications across a broader front. Thus, Pokrovsk and Dobropilya effectively extend Ukraine's defensive bubble to cover the entire region, making any Russian consolidation of control impossible. At the same time, losing one could mean losing another in short succession, with the rest of the region following suit. This has been why Russia has been willing to sacrifice catastrophic numbers of troops to capture Pokrovsk, and why Ukraine has been equally determined to hold it at all costs. It's also why recent reports of Russians approaching Pokrovsk are so devastating to the rhetoric surrounding the Ukrainian defense. It shows that Ukraine is increasingly desperate in trying not to show any weakness whatsoever. At the same time, it showcases just how important every village in the area is, as every victory forces Russian troops to change tactics and fall back, and relieves just a bit of pressure on Ukraine's armed forces. The recent liberation of Suketska, Kucherov Yar, as well as other villages also represents Ukraine's ability to exploit Russia's summer failure. Every village reclaimed is territory that Russia paid an enormous price to capture, but now lost due to Moscow's offensive culminating before achieving its objectives. Russia pushed too hard, advanced too far with inadequate forces, and now watches as the gains evaporate under Ukrainian pressure. What makes this particularly devastating for Russia is the timing. These losses come at a moment when Moscow desperately needs to show progress, not setbacks. The summer offensive was supposed to be decisive. Instead, it's turned into yet another Russian failure that Ukraine is now converting into momentum for its own operations. These are reflected in the broader geopolitics surrounding the control of Donbass, or lack thereof. Helping Ukraine convert that momentum is the newest of their developments, drones. Ukrainian drone production has increased by 900% over the past year. Monthly output has ramped up from 20,000 drones in the summer of 2024 to 200,000 currently. And this isn't just more of the same old FPV drones we've seen in 2023. Ukraine is producing increasingly sophisticated systems, including fiber optic controlled drones that are immune to Russian electronic warfare, AI-guided systems that can operate autonomously, and long-range strike drones capable of hitting targets inside Russia itself. But most importantly, Ukraine is actively producing the majority of drones that have become the war's defining weapon system. By divesting itself from Western supplies for drones, Ukraine has become at least partly independent while still managing to secure its defensive capabilities. By doing so, they are allowing NATO to provide systems that are more dependent on technical advantages that established Western military-industrial complexes have, such as tanks, artillery, aircraft, and missile systems. To support this production boom while staying out of reach of Russian strikes, Ukraine has been establishing manufacturing partnerships with NATO countries. Romania, for one, has announced plans to jointly produce defensive drones with Ukraine for use by both countries and other NATO allies. Denmark has also proposed letting Ukrainian manufacturers share their production capacities with Denmark instead of keeping them solely restricted to domestic soil. At the same time, Denmark has suggested that Ukraine could sell some of its more advanced drones and designs to NATO, which would help boost its economy and allow it to receive NATO equipment in equal trade rather than as donations or as part of the loan. This independence strengthens Ukraine's hand in any negotiations because it demonstrates sustainability, allowing Kyiv to continue fighting regardless of external political pressures. Now let's look at the Russian side of the equation, because the picture is increasingly grim. Moscow is facing an interconnected set of crises regarding manpower, economics, and morale that are fundamentally unsustainable. Let's start with the soldiers themselves, or lack thereof. September saw Putin order Russia's largest fall conscription in 9 years, with 135,000 men aged 18 to 30 being drafted. This also comes after a spring draft of 160,000, the highest since autumn 2011. Russia is also moving toward year-round conscription starting in 2026, replacing the current seasonal system. But these numbers reflect desperation, not strength. Despite recruiting hundreds of thousands of men, Russia continues to face severe manpower shortages at the front. Russia doesn't really need bodies, as it has practically 1 million of them to throw at Ukraine at any given time. What Russia lacks is dedicated soldiers who won't immediately desert or die in the first assault. By some counts, roughly 70,000 Russian soldiers are expected to desert the army in 2025, which is a tenth of the committed force in Ukraine. The 41st Army, for example, recorded nearly 8,000 deserters, which is estimated to be roughly 50% of the original troop size. Russia has tried to improve recruitment through financial incentives that have grown increasingly desperate. In 2024, soldiers from Moscow could earn up to 7.1 million rubles in their first year, including a 1.9 million rubles signing bonus and other pay benefits, about $82,000 at the then current exchange rate. That amount is nearly 70% of Putin's total official stated presidential income. In far-off regions, monthly payments are more than 2.4 times greater than the average Russian salary, with one-time signing bonuses equal to 22 times the monthly minimum wage. More than 50 regions are reported to have increased payments for military contracts. These rapidly increasing bonuses are indicative of the severe troop shortages, as such incentives wouldn't be needed if the ranks were filled with eager recruits. But these high salaries are threatened by budget realities. Russia's 2026 draft budget shows defense spending dropping from 13.5 trillion rubles, $161 billion, to 13 trillion rubles, $157 billion, the first decrease since the war began. This decrease is worsened by Russian inflation, which is sitting at 8% against the March high of 10%. Realistically, though, These inflation numbers are skewed and don't represent the real image of its economy. This is supported by the fact that Putin has planned for additional taxation measures in 2026, suggesting that it's pulling even more money from the rest of the budget to the military. But that money is for soldiers ready to join the fight. Those who have already served their time are getting the short end of the stick. Russia is cutting compensation for wounded soldiers and their families to save money. Payments to the families of deceased soldiers, as well as payments to wounded soldiers and their families, will fall from 78 billion rubles, about $967 million, in 2025 to 58 billion rubles, about $719 million. Funding for the Defenders of the Fatherland Fund, which supports veterans, will be cut by more than half, from 34.7 billion rubles, approximately $421 million, to 13.9 billion rubles, or $172 million. Think about what this means. Russia is paying more men to fight while simultaneously reducing what it pays to those who have already fought and are killed or wounded. This economic contradiction will further undermine morale and recruitment. It creates a window of vulnerability that Ukraine is positioned to exploit. As Russia struggles with the economic arithmetic of sustaining its military, Ukraine's momentum could force Moscow into increasingly difficult choices between maintaining force levels and economic stability. But economic and industrial aspects pale in comparison to the geopolitics, which is showcased by the spectacular collapse of planned peace talks between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Just 4 days ago, the White House announced there would be no plans for President Trump to meet with President Putin in the immediate future. This is a massive blow to Putin's strategy. After Trump and Putin spoke by phone on October 16th, the US president announced they would meet in Budapest to discuss ending the war. Moscow clearly saw this as an opportunity to secure favorable terms. A ceasefire along current lines would allow Russia to consolidate control over occupied territory, while portraying itself as the reasonable party seeking peace. But the talks collapsed almost immediately after Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held preliminary discussions. According to multiple sources, Lavrov made clear that Russia would not accept an immediate ceasefire and reiterated hardline demands like more territory, non-alignment, and broader guarantees. Trump's response was telling. "I don't want to have a wasted meeting. I don't want to have a waste of time, so I'll see what happens." This represents a significant shift from earlier Trump rhetoric that seemed to favor pressuring Ukraine into territorial concessions. The reason for that is that Putin could have overplayed his hand. By refusing to show any flexibility on territorial demands and continuing to frame the war in maximalist terms, Putin convinced Trump, or at least his advisors, that Moscow isn't actually interested in serious negotiations. European leaders and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky issued a joint statement, pointing out that Russia's stalling tactics have shown time and again that Ukraine is the only party serious about peace. For Ukraine, this is strategically crucial. Putin's entire approach has been built on the assumption that he can wait for Western support for Ukraine to peter out, secure a favorable deal through Trump, and consolidate his gains. The collapse of the Budapest summit suggests this strategy isn't working. Every day the war continues without Russian diplomatic progress is another day for Ukraine to strengthen its position militarily and politically. This all stems from the fact that Trump's only real suggestions so far, beyond the mineral deal, have been to freeze the war along current battle lines as a starting point for negotiations. Ukraine can't really accept these terms as is, given the current state of the war. A freeze along current lines would leave roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory, including much of Donetsk, under Russian occupation. It would effectively reward Russian aggression, provide Moscow time to consolidate control and rebuild military capabilities, and create a frozen conflict that could reignite at any moment Russia feels ready for another push. European leaders and Zelensky pushed back against this position, issuing a joint statement emphasizing they remain committed to the principle that international borders must not be changed by force. But the fact that Trump is proposing this framework at all represents a strategic threat to Ukrainian objectives. This is why Ukraine is pushing so hard right now, even as winter approaches. Every mile of territory reclaimed and every Russian unit degraded changes the maths of any future talks. If Trump eventually does broker talks that freeze the lines, Ukraine wants those lines as far east as possible. There's also a deeper strategic calculation at play. By demonstrating continued military capability and showing that they can not only hold territory but actively reclaim it, Ukraine is signaling to Trump and other Western leaders that a freeze isn't necessary or inevitable. The more Ukraine can demonstrate momentum, the harder it becomes to justify pressuring Kyiv into accepting permanent territorial losses. Zelensky has also noted that Putin returned to diplomacy and called Trump as soon as the US broached the possibility of increasing military support to Ukraine. but then postponed talks when that didn't coalesce. This insight drives Ukrainian strategy. Maintain military pressure to create negotiating leverage. Don't allow Russia to consolidate. Don't give Moscow the breathing room to rebuild. Keep pushing, keep degrading Russian capabilities, keep imposing costs that make the war unsustainable for the Kremlin. However, political winds can shift quickly, and Ukraine knows it. By demonstrating effective use of existing capabilities to achieve battlefield results, Ukraine makes the case for continued support. And the more Ukraine can show it's not just surviving, but actively reversing Russian gains, the easier it becomes to secure the weapons, ammunition, and financial resources needed to go further and deeper. The villages around Pokrovsk might not make headlines the way major offensives do, but they represent a shift in how the war is being fought and could be fought in the near future. Russia was counting on Western support to fade and Ukraine to crack. They assumed that time was on their side. But the war of attrition cuts both ways and in unexpected terms. Every month the war continues is another month for Ukraine to build domestic production capacity, and another month for Russia's economy to deteriorate under sanctions and casualties to accumulate beyond what is reasonable to recover from. And if Moscow can't hold the few villages it captured at such horrific costs, it stands no chance of actually going through the entirety of Donetsk or Ukraine as a whole. Of course, the war isn't over, as Russia still controls significant Ukrainian territory. Moscow still has resources to draw on and can seemingly sustain operations and create headlines about promising continued industrial growth. But the trajectory is increasingly problematic for the Kremlin, as every Ukrainian victory and takeover of its territory is just one more signal to the West that it's worth it to amplify the economic and geopolitical pressure. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn more about the broader strategic situation in Ukraine, check out our other videos analyzing the military and economic dimensions of this conflict, and subscribe to stay updated on daily developments. And thank you for watching.